Extinction means just that. Something no longer exists, gone forever. But in trying to prevent species disappearing, could we be creating more problems? Should we perhaps just let it happen? You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. Yes, could we need a rethink about how best to save the creatures and plants that call our planet home? There'll be some ways that work, some perhaps that could be improved, and some that are simply wrong. And that's what we're debating with our panel today.
Preserving natural beauty and vulnerable wildlife. A global quest to save species and habitats. The conservation effort is generally applauded, but it comes with considerable costs, financial and sometimes human, and it has mixed results. Do we need to rethink our approach to conservation? The World Wildlife Foundation says the global extinction rate is as much as 1,000 times faster than it should be. Between 1970 and 2012, animal populations declined 58%.
So conservation is critical, not just for one particular spot, one particular park, one particular lake. It's critical for our entire ecosystem.
In the United States, around 1,500 species are endangered or threatened, with funding for many of them falling short. Estimates suggest there is overspend in some areas, while others receive less than 10% of the funding they need. And a 2012 study suggested that the global cost for protecting biodiversity could reach $76 billion per year. Conservation can carry a human cost. Native Bushmen in Botswana in Africa have fallen foul of government conservation efforts. Huge game parks have pushed them from their territory. Critics say governments use conservation as a pretext for forcing indigenous people from their homelands to make room for tourism and industry. But research has shown that when conservation efforts are successful, they have a beneficial knock-on effect. Conservationists estimate that for every dollar spent on biodiversity and conservation, a country can expect to receive between $7 to $10 in other social, economic, and environmental benefits. With the looming threat of global warming, worsening air pollution, and rapid rates of extinction, the way we treat our environment has become a worldwide priority. But do we need to treat environmental protection more holistically? And are we able to manage such an enormous task?
And I'm very pleased to say with me at the round table today we have Paul de Zylva, who is Senior Campaigner for Friends of the Earth, also with us. Richard Wellings, Deputy Research Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs. We have Paul Morling, Economist at the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and Mark Jones from the Born Free Foundation. Very good to have you with us here on Roundtable. Mark, let me ask you first of all, and this is something that I'm sure we all have an opinion of. We talked about the cost of conservation, but can we afford not to conserve?
Well, thank you very much for inviting us onto the programme. We're very pleased to be here. I certainly think there's no question about this. We can't afford not to conserve and protect our wildlife. We're in what many people are calling the sixth great extinction crisis through the millennia, but the first that's caused by a single species, or largely caused by a single species, and that's us, in what many are dubbing the Anthropocene era. So we're losing species at unprecedented rates in
any idea how
human
many?
history. Well, if you look at the IUCN Red List, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which monitors these things, they estimate that something like 1 in 5 mammal species, 1 in 5 reptiles, as many as 1 in 3 amphibians are now threatened with extinction. We could lose many of those species, and many more are declining. But we've got to remember that we shouldn't just think of species in terms of individual collections of animals. Individual animals and groups of animals and species have places within the ecosystems in which they exist, and they perform important functions.
And this is the point, isn't it? It is an ecosystem. It is something that we all need to be put in place or kept in place with different elements to it to help us live properly.
That's right. I think the danger is that it's almost like we're constructing a global game of Jenga and we're pulling bits out and we don't know what happens. You know, bits end up on the floor or it becomes messy, and you can look at...
And then finally it collapses.
Well, you can start to see some of the trends happen. So the removal of top predators in the ocean, such as sharks, means that you suddenly get a massive influx or rise of jellyfish or squid, and that upsets the natural balance. So obviously, that's one very big example from our oceans. You can see similar examples elsewhere, where if you tip the balance too far with certain species, they will decline very quickly to a point they can't recover, and that's a form of extinction. They may not be totally dead, but if they can't reproduce, then eventually they will die out, and other species take over, and that's where you start playing that game of Jenga turns into a complete lottery. And I think, as Mark's pointed out, you lose stability and you lose a bit of certainty. And so there is great effort going in to try and stop extinctions where we can. Not all extinction can be reversed, I would say. Some of it is probably a natural process. The trends show that it is happening at a higher level than we would normally expect.
But we're talking about the cost of it, and I think everybody at this table would agree that it is great to conserve. And you wanted to jump in, so I'll let you make your point first. But the question is, are we spending too much money? Could we spend more? Where do we draw the line? But sorry, first of all, Paul.
So coming back to the original proposition, for me, conservation of wildlife is a moral imperative. It's something I believe that we as a species on the planet should not act in a way that commits other species to extinction. But coming back to the sort of grubby business of money and the utilitarian concerns, we've looked at the costs of conservation. We have had targets for a number of years to achieve protected area status across certain proportions of the globe and to reduce species extinction risks for those species of most concern. We've never really looked at how much it would cost in total. So we did an exercise about 5 years ago to look at that with academics at Cambridge University and colleagues at BirdLife. And the numbers look big. So to achieve species conservation targets globally, you're looking at something in the region of $1 billion to $5 billion. To look at
a year?
A year for 12 years.
Okay.
And that would reduce those species at most risk down at a threat level.
But it's a lot of money, but that's chicken feed in many ways,
well, in some sense,
global terms.
If you then look at protected areas, to achieve an effective network of protected areas, where we're talking about 17% of the land mass, terrestrial land mass, maybe 10% of marine areas, that's in the region of about 70 billion a year. So when you put that against what we currently spend in terms of official development assistance, maybe that's around about 150 billion a year. So it looks like a big number. When you set it against global GDP, and you set it against $75 trillion.
You set it against what the Conservative Party is giving to the DUP in Northern Ireland, just to sort of stay in government. It is not a big number in relative terms,
At the UK level, we need 2 billion. We have a fiscal budget of 800 billion. You're talking about 0.1%. So in those terms, and if you look at the money we have under assets, financial assets globally, you're talking about 250 trillion.
But the difficulty perhaps, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but the difficulty perhaps is in convincing those people who hold the purse strings that this kind of conservation is an imperative when they have other more politically demanding notices in their inbox.
I think government is too short term, and it is forced always to think in the short term.
Not trying to keep you out of the debate, but we'll come.
They don't, so there is a question about whether government is up to the job.
Yeah.
And not all money necessarily has to come from government, I would also say. And I'd also say that not all conservation has to be expensive. There are lots of examples where community-led conservation, it's not that it happens cost-free, but it doesn't need huge amounts of money to deliver good conservation benefit. But obviously, if you're talking about, trying to protect rhino and ivory and elephants in Africa, that you've got to think about whole landscapes and people and monitoring and things
and
like
lifestyles, and we'll get on to that
Absolutely.
in just a moment. Richard, sorry, I didn't mean to shut you out.
It's fine. But what I would say is, politicians have to make these difficult trade-offs, and we can't have conservation at any cost, because potentially these resources could be used to save people's lives, for example, and that might be more important. And also, obviously, spending this money, particularly when governments do it, has its own problems in itself. So if you're trying to create these conservation areas, it might mean kicking the local people off the land, or at least constraining how they behave and start to interfering with their...
But you're not anti-conservation, are you?
I'm not, but I just think there are problems with this, particularly when governments get involved. They also have, ulterior motives, wider political agendas for interfering in particular countries, and this makes it all very messy in practice.
But I think we've got to start thinking about changing the paradigm and changing the language we're using around conservation. If we're talking about, I don't know, education or health or employment opportunities for the future, we tend to talk about investing money in order to create future benefits. And I think that's the kind of language we should be using around conservation and species protection and habitat protection and ultimately ecosystem preservation, or preserving the functionality of ecosystems. We've got to be talking about this in terms of investment in future generations, because so many billions of people around the planet rely, one way or another, on the functionality of natural ecosystems for clean air, for clean water, for climate change mitigation, for food, for other resources, many for employment opportunities and ways of generating income as well. And if those ecosystems start to fail, as Paul says, as you sort of allow bits of them to disappear, at some point the functionality of those ecosystems will start to drop significantly. That's going to affect millions, if not billions, of people over
Of course, it's very difficult to operationalise in practice, though, as you well know, when you're dealing with corrupt local politicians, etc., etc. NGOs, state-funded NGOs that have perhaps a different agenda that's not really in the interest of the wildlife. For example, I mean, I'm quite keen on animal rights, but there is definitely an animal rights agenda that's seeping through into a lot of the state-funded NGOs operating in Africa, for example.
Well, what's wrong with that?
Well, the problem is, and there is a counter-argument, that to allow some hunting, for example, is actually a good way of incentivising the local people to have an economic interest in preserving the wildlife. Whereas if you take too strong an animal rights line and say no hunting whatsoever, it can be counterproductive.
Okay.
I think that one of the big shifts we've seen in conservation in certainly the last decade is a growing acceptance that it's not just a nice to have. This is not just the life-enhancing benefits we get from conserving species. It is that critical need for humanity to protect the systems, the natural systems on which we depend.
But not only a moral obligation, but a practical one.
Absolutely. The utilitarian values associated with protecting systems that are providing livelihood opportunities, that are sequestering carbon and the benefits that we've just heard articulated are crucial to this, and it's how you do it. I agree that the practical realities of doing conservation now, where you've got to look after those or take into consideration these ecosystem services and how people benefit, is challenging, but operating in the world is challenging for all of us. So finding a way to do it, I think, is a challenge, but I think we do have a much better understanding of the need to take into consideration any of the costs you impose on local people and understand that the benefits that we are providing through conservation.
But it's not just a financial cost. I'm going to quote Rosalind Duffy, described as a world expert on the ethical dimensions of wildlife conservation and management, Manchester University, wrote a book called How We're Getting Conservation Wrong. It is a couple of years old, but she says, when wildlife reserves, for example, are established, local communities can suddenly find that their everyday subsistence activities, such as hunting and collecting wood, have been outlawed. And this describes a bigger picture, doesn't it? It means changing communities if you want to conserve. Is there a way to adopt what she describes as better practices without harming those people who call these areas home? And how do you do it?
Well, I don't think there's a single answer, but I think it's not wrong to identify where there has been bad practice or where the desire to protect a species or a piece of landscape has almost been a kind of ring-fenced approach. And the benefit of looking across wider landscapes is that you can allow activities which are, cultural, indigenous practice alongside conservation effort.
But excuse me, it's not really these charities' place to tell local people what they can and can't do.
I wasn't suggesting that.
This is appalling, saying, oh, you can do this, but you can't do that. I mean, it's effectively a new form of imperialism channeled through the corrupt local politicians.
I wasn't suggesting that there's any diktat, but I think we reach a broader understanding about how you want a landscape or an area to operate and to be managed overall.
Yeah, the idea of we is also a form of imperialism. It's not your responsibility.
I think
it's the local people's
I think
land.
you're reading something into what I was saying, which I wasn't actually saying.
Well, use the word we. It's not your.
Okay,
it's not down to you. It's down to the local people.
I wasn't talking
It's
about
absolutely appalling.
But
I wasn't talking about me. I was talking about if
Were
an
you talking
area
about
or a
as an
country.
international community, perhaps?
So I'm doing some work with colleagues in Madagascar, where to do with and Madagascar is one of those real hotspots for biodiversity, which is right on a crossroads about deciding which way it wants to go down the line. Is it going to get more loss of its indigenous species, not just animals but plants as well, or is it going to be plundered for mining resources? And some of the imperial attitude is actually not coming from the conservation organisations; it's coming from the government. And in league with shadowy bodies being set up by mining institutions. So this works both ways. What I was trying to suggest was we probably need to reboot the way in which this is looked at and look at what we mean by protected areas and the kind of activities that can go on in those areas, because they can include cultural activities and traditional activities.
This is dictatorial again, saying you're deciding what can and can't.
Do you not accept that there has to be some kind of system in place agreed by various people? Okay, first of all on a local level, and then perhaps on an international level, that looks after the benefits for both the people who live there and the benefits of the animals and birds.
It's a very elitist top-down process at the moment, where effectively what you find in practice is time and time again you find local people's land is effectively stolen and they're no longer allowed to participate in their traditional activities on that land, where it's wood gathering, hunting, etc., etc.
Which is what she talks about.
And of course, a lot of foreign aid more generally is having these counterproductive effects, where Western governments are funding the new roads into the rainforest or whatever.
Well, how would you go about it then? How would you?
Well, the first thing is a win-win thing is to avoid the counterproductive effects of foreign aid, different forms of foreign aid that are effectively pulling in the opposite direction from wildlife conservation. So, the new road schemes, the dams, etc., that are being put in, they're not economically viable, but they're just used to effectively pay off the elites in those countries. And then, obviously, the corrupt families then move in and steal the land.
Okay, but how do you go about it?
I certainly agree. I agree with Paul, absolutely, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, but there are some very good examples out there of conservancy-based practices and projects which are working very well. I'm thinking of, perhaps not perfect, but I'm thinking of the Northern Rangelands Trust in Kenya, for example, which covers, I think there's about 35 conservancies across an area of about 4.5 million hectares, on which 600,000 plus people, local people, are benefiting through the ability, alongside local government representatives and through attracting funding from international bodies or NGOs or whatever, are able to take a much greater role in managing the land on which they live and the wildlife that lives there.
But
their benefit, there's some very good data coming back from that. As I say, it's not a perfect system, and there are problems in some of those conservancies, but there's some very good data coming back saying that local people are benefiting through the creation of jobs, through ecotourism or whatever.
This is a form of incentivisation, isn't it?
Beginning to recover in many of those areas because those people are able to see the value of the wildlife, not as a consumptive
But the local people didn't
thing,
choose this outcome necessarily, did they? It was imposed from above on them.
Well, many of the outcomes...
Perhaps you're reversing something that they imposed upon the community in the first place.
I think we're moving towards a much more pragmatic approach to conservation. I think what's described here as the kind of fortress conservation approach as a previous paradigm of keeping wildlife and people separate. I think it still exists in patches. I don't think we get it right everywhere all the time. But I think we are looking much more at a pragmatic approach where you do take into consideration the issues, what's happening on the ground. And what I like most about this new way of thinking around ecosystem services is it forces you to think about the beneficiaries and losers of any land intervention you may want to pursue. And it's perfectly legitimate in some instances, if you're looking at forest management, to look at some of the global public goods provided by forests. You can come to some negotiation about paying for the carbon or paying for the other benefits, which is mutually beneficial.
Yeah, but remember, even the governments you might be negotiating with in a lot of third world countries aren't actually legitimate in themselves. They're just artificial creations of the colonial era.
An organisation like us who will work through local partnership groups, we will be working with people on the ground where we can. It's a messy business, and yes, there's lots of corruption, there's lots of stuff to get through.
You have to bring this back to how do you get the message across? And while we're all adults at this table, it's the younger generation, surely, that you have to convince that it's a world worth protecting in all ways, whether it be from the local communities or whether it be
the younger generation gets it
and the fauna. Okay, so if the younger generation gets it, where are they going to lose it? Because I got it as a young person, and I'm sure a great many other people did, and then suddenly something else became more important.
Okay, you look at the average. I don't know, I'm not saying I'm typical, but I grew up in the countryside. I was surrounded by nature. I wouldn't say I was a nature expert. I then got interested in things that, football and racing cars and girls. And then later in my life, something clicked and I got more interested in environmental issues. I think people come to the issues in all sorts of ways. I don't doubt for a minute that the seriousness of the issue is affecting all generations, not just younger. And we shouldn't just kind of think it's only a problem for the young. It's a generational thing. But I think there's quite a lot of concern among younger people about the way in which decisions are made, arguably in their name, using very often their taxes or their parents' taxes. And I think there's a good discussion to be had about how we unlock or make better decisions.
And this is what you're trying to do, is it?
We have to look at the role of government, and we have to look at longer-term, better decision-making and the money that goes behind that over time. And money does, as I said at the beginning, money doesn't just have to come from government. There are lots of institutions that I think are increasingly going, we're in trouble, this isn't right, what's our role? Now, however you carve up the figures, there is more than enough money knocking around to do good environmental action and conservation effort. There's no shortage of money. I would say it's usually in the wrong place.
Can I just ask, excuse me, I would like each one of you to think for our audience out there of one or two particular examples of where you think we should be looking in terms of conservation, species or areas, just for the end of the programme. But if you're going back to the point you're making there about young people being willing to take on these arguments, if you are preaching to the converted to some extent, how do you keep them in the choir?
That's a good question. And clearly, we've been talking about local communities and empowering local communities to take back, if you like, the responsibility for looking after their own wildlife and in their area that they interact with, and recognising and reaping the rewards from the benefits that wildlife can bring, both because of its aesthetic or intrinsic qualities through ecotourism or whatever, and also because of the contribution it makes to the ecosystem services on which those people often rely. But we're also dealing with a world in which culture is changing very rapidly. The dynamics of communities is changing very rapidly. You only have to look to the Far East, to China, to see the massive growth in both population and disposable income amongst those population. You look at the urbanisation of traditional rural communities across much of the world. And we're also, this is all happening in the context of social media explosion, where the way we get and disseminate information is changing very rapidly as well. So I think there are huge challenges when you look at population growth, when you look at the change in dynamics in the way human communities work. But I think social media and other outlets which so many more people have access to these days, almost regardless of their personal wealth, which wasn't.
I'm sorry to say we're coming towards the end, and I'm going to go back to that point I made just now. Can you, for those of our viewers who'd be interested to hear where you'd like to see some particular focus go, name a species, a habitat, or something that you'd like to see more attention on the next 12 months? Okay, come back to you in a minute.
Well, I would say too, well, there's fantastic value tropical forests for all sorts of reasons, biodiversity and people benefits. I would say also a systemic change in the way we take some decisions to benefit wildlife and to make our economic systems less or more environmentally benign.
Yeah, I'm also particularly concerned about the rainforest, tropical rainforest, for those reasons. But I want to see an end to a lot of this counterproductive foreign aid that actually harms the environment. So when Western governments are funding things like new roads and new energy schemes that act as a conduit for the destruction of those areas and the theft of land from the local people.
Paul, you've had plenty of time to think about it. You've
So-
got to come up with a real zinger, and that's not an animal.
Conservation begins at home, so if we can't save our bee species, then we really are in trouble. And a bit more exotic, there's something about snow leopards that appeals, and I think as an indicator of a species that lives in the margins.
Yeah, and the
above
Iranian
the snow
cheetah I
line.
was reading about last week, endangered because of sanctions.
Yeah, it's a complicated world, and this is why I think people's focus on the way in which governance and government operates is going to become part of the conservation debate and the environment debate, rather than just going around another summit on the environment, another one on climate change, another one on biodiversity. We've got to make this an everyday thing rather than just once every 2 or 3 years where big pledges are made and not much happens.
And that is hopefully, to some extent, what we might have been able to do at this roundtable. Thank you very much indeed for coming to join us here on TRT World. We're mindful of the people that these movements affect, but we're also very mindful of the creatures that we share our planet with, and which I passionately believe it is our duty to protect and to conserve. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a world that is not only a great deal poorer, but considerably emptier. You've been watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. See you next time, I hope. Bye-bye.